Welcome to the Ridgemont Podcast. Before we get started with this episode, I'd really appreciate it if you could like or subscribe. Hope you enjoy the show. In today's episode, we are with Raj Nayyar of Aareon Group. Hi, Raj.
Yep. Nice to see you, John.
So you're the former founder and CEO of Fixflo, who a lot of our listeners will know of, being a platform that automates the reporting and actioning of repairs between tenants and landlords.
Yep.
I know you from law school. So why don't we start at the beginning? You were a lawyer. What kind of lawyer were you?
So I started as a real estate lawyer. I trained at Lovells and then moved to Travers Smith for a couple of years. Then I got Rugby World Cup tickets. This was way back in 2010 for the World Cup in 2011. It turns out having 6 to 8 weeks off work to go and watch rugby was not going to be acceptable. So I got a job over at a law firm in New Zealand and stayed out there for a couple of years. Came back and ran away from law, just as you leaned into it, John, and started something in the tech world.
So we're not actually going to talk much about Fixflo today. We're going to talk about other stuff, which we're going to in a minute. But how did you and when did you come up with the idea of Fixflo?
It was not the idea of Fixflo that came to me, more the problem. So, as I said, I moved over to New Zealand, and when I was over there, I was renting out a property in London and renting as a tenant in New Zealand. And at exactly the same time, I had a repair problem at both of the places. So, as a tenant, I had a really terrible experience with a leaking roof and clothes going mouldy and sort of water dripping inside. And my tenants in London also had a problem. And it struck me that the process, the analogue process of telephones, emails, delays, a lack of transparency was pretty rubbish for everybody. And so when I came back from New Zealand, tried to understand the problem a bit better and set about trying to fix it.
And fix it you did. Fixflo you built and in fact exited fairly recently. For entrepreneurs who are listening, are there any tips you can give for growing a business?
I think this is going to come up as a theme as we talk through stuff today, but it's really about being clear on your why. What is the purpose that motivates you? And I think whether it's for an entrepreneur or an employee or anybody, work is hard. Building a business is very hard, and it's quite a rocky ride. It's not necessarily linear, and it's quite hard to see the progress you make. And so being motivated by a broader sense of purpose and why is really powerful. So know what the change you're trying to deliver in the world is. And when people talk about pivots, particularly in technology businesses, it's not about changing what you do. It's about changing the route in which you get there. So the destination is likely to stay the same, which is the why that motivates you, but the path by which you get there may vary.
Yeah. Simon Sinek does a very good TEDx talk on why that our listeners might want to check out on YouTube. I said we weren't going to speak much about Fixflo. So my final question about it is, was it hard to exit and let go?
It was hard to exit because it meant it was a fundamental change. So prior to exit, my business partner and I effectively ran full decision making. We had full control and the full support of our board. We brought in non-execs, experienced tech investors and operators, but effectively we steered the ship. The big change was becoming part of what is a pretty sizable group and taking into account the consequences at group level for that. So I relinquished day-to-day operational control of Fixflo, but as part of my new role, Fixflo is one of the 4 companies in my portfolio that all do property technology, all are across the UK, and we get to operate at a scale that we couldn't have done prior to exit.
Yeah, I get that. So a key part of building a business is building teams. In fact, I suppose a business founder or CEO, their key role, you might say, is to build teams and make sure money's in the bank, and that's pretty much it. So how did you recruit, or how do you recruit now?
So I think they're 2 very different questions. So having never previously run a business or grown a business, we recruited incredibly poorly at the start, and I'll talk through some of the mistakes we made and continued to make, actually, and where we are now and what we try to do differently. So one of the attractions of talent, and attracting talent is key, particularly if you are new to a sector or to starting a business is to go with people with the shiny CV and the experience. And for me, that is a horrendous mistake. There are three core values, soft attributes that really, to me, make a difference in the people you hire. And they are attitude. Is the person, do they have a growth mindset, and do they have a positive impact on the other people around them? The second is drive. Do they want to succeed, and will they work hard to get there? And the third is coachability. So will they change and grow, particularly as the business grows? And with those three attributes in place, the hard skills can largely be filled in and learned over time. But what you can't do is take someone with the hard skills without those soft skills and turn them into A players.
And during the recruitment process, how did you identify these individuals?
So it's, I come back to purpose, and we're going to keep coming back there, is understanding why they want to work in the business. And answers like, I want to work in technology. Technology is attractive. That's great as an overall statement, but why here? What is it about the mission? Explain to me what you think our mission is and why you're excited, and why we want people who will bounce out of bed every day and be excited about making a positive impact and delivering on what we saw as the key things, which was people living in safe homes and building trust in the property sector. And so that's really what we drove our recruitment around. Having a high degree of trust and empowerment once they're in role. So that sort of failure culture is entirely acceptable. So very, very few mistakes. I say very, very few, perhaps slightly different in your line of work, John, are terminal to reputation or a business,
yes.
But they're great learning opportunities, and sharing and socialising those mistakes are great learning opportunities. It's the way an organisation learns, improves and iterates.
Yes.
And there's quite an interesting paper about the difference between sort of the airline industry and the medical profession about how mistakes are treated. So leaning into that and really sharing expertise and learnings is really powerful, and it's an accelerator for the business.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Now, if you were starting again, what would the one mistake you made in recruitment? What would you not do this time? So it's talking about when you were starting up, not your position now and the businesses that you look after, but if you were a founder again, what would you do?
I would spend more time understanding the people and hire more slowly, I think. So make those initial hires or initial partners, parts of the family, depending on how you want to frame it. That's the nucleus that everything grows from, and it really sets the culture as you go on, and getting the right people through the door in the seats and motivated and excited and aligned with what you're doing. And what you're doing will change, and they'll shape what you're doing. So they're the key. I'd say the first 5 to 10 people through the door are the key hires, and they make the biggest difference.
And you get 5 to 10 people through the door. Suddenly you've got a team. You might have a bigger team. How do you get people to gel together, particularly where they have different personalities and different backgrounds?
It's interesting. It's about having a range of socialising events. So I think at sort of 10 people, everybody can have a personal connection with everybody else in the organisation. That starts to fray at 20. It's definitely gone at 30. And when you're operating at hundreds of people, that doesn't happen. So it's sort of slicing it down. You can expect to keep those human bonds within smaller teams. So keep subdividing teams, and then you have the complexity of cross-functional, cross-team collaboration. And it's about setting up, well, I say setting up, that's the wrong way I think of describing it, is supporting people in setting up the social encounters. So whether that be a board games night or computer games night, a trip to the pub is fairly typical, at least in British business culture, meals, theatre, whatever it is that people want to do. I don't think you as a founder have to drive that. And in fact, it's probably better if you don't, but instead be very supportive. And it's, I guess, particularly difficult at the early stage where every penny matters. I'm not saying that these have to be particularly expensive things, but particularly especially as a business scales, the amount that is spent on team happiness and harmony is significantly outweighed by most of the other costs in the business. And so I think it's a great investment.
Yeah. And do you think all of that is more difficult now that people are working from home?
I think it is absolutely more difficult to build human-to-human connections, notwithstanding the advances in technology, whether it's Slack or Teams or Zoom or whatever it is. Physical proximity makes a difference. When I started as a lawyer, and I'm not sure if you heard the same phrase, it was about sharing an office with a partner or a senior associate, and the phrase that was used was learning by osmosis.
Yeah.
So overhearing the conversations, being involved in snippets of things and sharing information, the sort of informal information sharing is really powerful, both in terms of the actual day-to-day job, but also in terms of building those connections. So it is harder, and I think that employers, founders, have to work harder to sort of evolve what the office is there for. Most work does not require physical proximity, but the human connection and the teamship really does.
And what impact does effective teamship, as you put it, have on a business?
It changes everything. If you were to take a sporting analogy, which I know you're often fond of, John, if you had 11 of the most talented players on a pitch, each playing their own game in their own style, without any particular overall tactical structure or strategy, they're not going to. They may win, but they may not be as effective as they could be. And so it's about creating that common vision, purpose, alignment, and understanding. That's where great things happen.
And creating a sense of momentum within the business as well, which is a lot harder when people are working remotely. There's something about having an energized room of people where there's hustle and bustle and there's good news being spread, and someone has a great call, a new client comes in, and suddenly things are sort of rolling forward quickly.
Yes.
So going from how to gel a team, when you've got a team of people in the business, and particularly I guess this applies to juniors, but seniors as well, where they don't have equity, how do you make them feel like they're on the same journey as you and that they're invested?
I don't think it's about making them feel they are on the same journey. So money is a byproduct of doing the right thing, and you have to pay the right package in total, whether it's base or bonus or whatever it is, to attract and retain talent. So let's say that's a given in what we're describing. But the mission that you're on is, I think, pretty unrelated to the equity. It's about the impact you're having on the world. And if you can see that impact, whether through, in our world, happier tenants, living in safer properties, or in the case of some of the neobanks, in people being able to transfer money back home easily and effectively and efficiently and safely, it's that motivates people more than anything else. That's the purpose.
And, most companies now have a culture and a set of core values. First of all, on the core values, how did you go about setting Fixflo's core values back in the day?
I didn't set them. It was a collaborative team effort. So we went through an exercise of describing Fixflo as a person. If Fixflo was a person, what kind of person would it be? What would it aspire to? And how do we articulate the character of what we're doing, not just now, but something that will have longevity over time? I don't think that culture isn't something that is written on a PowerPoint or on a website, and nor are values. They're instead the shared beliefs of the community that's created to deliver on a purpose.
And when did you first sit down with the team to talk about core values? How many were at Fixflo?
It was before we even really started. So Duncan, who co-founded Fixflo with me, wonderful, intelligent, lovely human being, before we started working together, so I had an idea and he had technology skills. We spent a day in a shared office space with a whiteboard describing how would we be with each other, and what kind of employer would we be if this was successful, and what kind of impact did we want to have. And that's where we started from. So that framed it. And there's a great book called The Partnership Charter that we used as a sort of framework to do that. And that set us on the first few steps. And then as the team grew, it evolved. And now, as a group in the UK, we've got, I'm going to say, about 350 employees across a few different brands. That is a continual iteration of what we do. But even within teams, I think that their cultures are and should be allowed to develop organically. It's definitely bottom up, not top down.
And what happens in, you've got 350, 400 people under you now. What happens when one of those is no longer aligned with your core values? How do you deal with that?
That's a really interesting question. I want to take it to an even baser question, which is what happens if someone is no longer aligned with the strategy of the business? So I think the strategy, the culture, the DNA, however you want to describe it, where you're going, why and how, is absolutely critical for people to be aligned with. And if somebody is not aligned, empowerment's really important. They should be empowered. Everybody should be empowered to challenge, to question, to poke, to prod.
Yeah.
But if at the end of that, they believe the world is blue and you believe the world is green, this isn't the right place for them to be. That you will end up with a friction-filled environment, and they are no longer aligned with the purpose or the core of the business.
So we were talking earlier about how important it is to get the team invested in as being part of the business's journey that they are on. When it comes to things like annual planning, how do you get buy-in to that when perhaps you're the one who's made the decision about what the annual goals are and how the team's going to get there? How do you get their buy-in to your ideas?
Again, I see it as a collaborative effort. At least it's slightly different at an earlier stage. So perhaps let's start there and then go on to as a business scale. So at an earlier stage, let's say a business of 10 people, I would expect everybody to be involved in that process. So I don't think that leadership imposes targets on people. They have to willingly accept, and everything should be stretching but achievable. If it's not stretching or it's not achievable, something's gone wrong in terms of the target setting.
Yeah.
And at least in the world I operate in, it's quite mathematical in terms of setting those targets with a decent amount of historical data. As you move on, when you've got hundreds of people, it's not everybody is involved at the top level, but they are involved in understanding their components. So if you think back to the sort of setup in the factory, which parts of the process are they involved in, and do they genuinely believe that if the inputs are there, they are able to convert a certain number of outputs at a relatively base level, so marketing qualified leads to sales accepted leads, whatever it is, through a funnel, just to give one example. And so it is a genuinely collaborative effort to get there. And if you don't have buy-in, then something's gone wrong through the process.
Have you had a meeting like that where you didn't get buy-in from the team you were meeting with to discuss goals? Or pushback from someone senior?
I'm trying to think of a specific example. I would be shocked if there weren't.
Yeah.
But then the budget's not set. The budget is only set when everybody is comfortable, both with the component elements and the outputs.
So we've spoken about important things that make up a team. So being aligned with the business, attitude, etc. What makes up a successful team? What are the factors?
Diversity of thought, experience and outlook is very, very powerful. If you end up working with the same types of people from the same sorts of backgrounds, you tend to have the same blind spots, and that's hugely dangerous. A range of skills and experience is also very valuable. I'm talking in sort of general terms.
Yeah.
But each person having their own area of accountability, ownership and responsibility is really important. They own that. So I guess the old school business term for it would be having their own swim lanes, where other people can share opinions, but they ultimately are the decision maker, is really important, because without that, their personal sense of purpose can be affected.
So talking about accountability and ownership, most employees anyway are subject to appraisals, quarterly, annual, whatever. What's the most effective way to appraise an individual, do you think?
Typically, I would do it predominantly on objective metrics. So I think sharing information's not just powerful but necessary. You can't expect someone to have the context that they need to understand their role, or going back to budget setting, what is expected over the next year and the forecast over future years, without openly sharing information. So the way we've done that is, I've tried lots of things, emails, but people didn't really engage with those very much. Metrics up on a dashboard, that gets a bit of engagement, but weekly transparent open meetings about all facets of the business, and then a monthly deeper dive on the financials. And so it's about being, I guess, brutally honest with people, and everybody understanding again which part they're focused on, where their swim lane is, and having clear metrics about what good looks like. And for us, in a lot of our functions, and thinking back to law firms, they had the same, that there are sort of benchmarks. So here are 4 criteria, the 4 hard criteria. If you hit 3 of them for 6 months, you will get a promotion. It's quite a mechanical thing, subject to you having a good attitude, showing drive and coachability throughout.
You spoke about having meetings with your teams and being really transparent with them about the finances of the business and where it's at. That must help employees feel part of the journey and part of what's going on, the fact that these things are not hidden from them, and that they can see the impact on what their decisions are having on the business and where the business is as a whole.
Yes, and I think it leads back to the question you asked earlier about how do people feel on your journey. Well, it's not a founder's journey, it's a collective journey. It takes a village to raise a child. It takes a bunch of brilliant people to raise a business, and so that's the approach.
What's the biggest challenge that you faced in building a team? So this could be recruitment, issues with discipline, issues with cultural alignment, that sort of thing.
It's one thing sticks out to me, which is helping people who typically would not do well with uncertainty become better at dealing with uncertainty. So what I mean by that is in a startup, scale up, or just any fast moving business, the only constant is change, and change happens at a rate that is really unusual for someone coming from a more corporate background.
Yeah.
What I found is people where it's been their first job sort of lean into it and accept it because there's no particular frame of reference. But taking someone who's worked in X PLC for 6 years, where decision-making processes are relatively slow and PowerPoint and Excel driven, it is a change, and people's roles change. So as you go from 1 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 50 employees, as your range of products and services change, as your competitive dynamic changes, as the market changes around you, there is a constant swirl of change, and it can take some people a while to get used to that, particularly as their day-to-day changes, and you can't provide, I guess, in absolute terms, what their role looks like in 6 months, let alone in 2 years.
So it's not for everyone.
It isn't for everyone. You have to, I think, if you're going to work in, I'm talking very, very much about the startup space. If you want to work in the startup space, you have to have a higher risk tolerance than I think is normal, and a higher propensity to accept change than is normal.
Thinking about all the teams that you've managed and the teams within those teams, what's the biggest achievement that a team's achieved in all the circumstances?
That's a brilliant question, and I think they've all achieved amazing things. There's the products that didn't exist 6 months ago that are now out being used in hundreds of thousands of homes. There's a whole new organisational setup as we've gone from independent scale up to part of massive European company. There's changes in roles. People have been moved across companies. It's just a constant. There's so much.
Working together, people can move mountains.
Yeah.
Sometimes a business leader has the opportunity to give great news to people. You've been promoted, or we've hit our targets. We're all going out for dinner, etc. But sometimes it's your responsibility to give bad news. How have you handled that?
Good question. Transparently, early. So give the news early. I don't think leaving people in a limbo state is fair on them. Being transparent about what you don't know and what you can't say, because in some cases you can't say everything, but you should lean towards sharing rather than withholding information.
Being honest.
Being honest, and trying to do the right by people, which is if a role in the organisation isn't right for them and there is no alternative, see what else you can do to help the person as a person, not the person as an employee.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. As you grow, the chance of having a bad egg in the business grows as you have more people. And when I say bad egg, they don't have to be mean-spirited or anything like that. They don't fit, or they no longer fit. And how quickly do you react to that? And how comfortable were you in dealing with those sort of situations?
So I think there are two distinct questions there. So the first is, if somebody no longer fits, what happens in effect? And what happens is, if you have the right values and culture through the business, typically they will come and tell you that it no longer fits. It's like, I don't know, I was going to use the analogy of an ill-fitting suit, but I don't think I've ever seen you in a suit, John. So
for the record, we're wearing very similar clothes today. It's a bit like I was once at Wimbledon. I must have been about, as in the tennis, and I must have been about 11 or 12, and I bumped into Tim Henman. And when I say bumped in, neither of us were looking where we were going, and we literally bumped into each other. And we both took a step backwards and looked at each other, and we were wearing exactly the same clothes. Now, Tim Henman was due to be on court. He was wearing an Adidas 3-stripe black jumper, matching shorts and white Adidas socks, and I was wearing exactly the same clothes. Really awkward conversation, which was limited to him going all right and me going all right, and us then walking around each other. Anyway, sorry.
Thanks, John. So I just go back. So if over time roles may not be right for someone, in my experience they'll typically tell you. It won't feel right to them. They won't bounce out of bed wanting to come to work. It will feel like grind rather than flow, and they'll come and tell you. Also, if you have the right culture and values, it's pretty apparent to everybody else in the team as well. So if you have a high-performing team, a high-performing culture, people who are not pulling their weight, delivering, or perhaps even just enjoying it, other people will notice, and before anything gets to me, is typically other members of the team will have had that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's right. Communication with the team is really important. So we've spoken about transparency and providing clarity. How important is communication to a team? And that could be amongst the team themselves, not just from leader to the team. And how do you effectively communicate with the team?
Communication is hugely important, and it's quite hard to over-communicate. Repetition is also hugely important, and it's hard to over-repeat things before the full context perhaps of what's in your mind is understood. And it's an area that I struggle with as the business has grown. So having various teams spread across the UK, it's quite hard, I find, to spend enough time on communication. So it's an area that I'm working on actively. So you've got what I describe as broadcast messages, the sort of state of the nation or strategic. You have the decision-making communication where you're facilitating a dialogue. You may not even be the decision maker, and you may often not be, but you're facilitating a dialogue between the people who are the experts who will make the decision, and that could be a cross-functional. And it was a phrase I heard this morning, which is the CEO's main job is to be the chief visionary officer. So their job is to explain the vision and the purpose and to keep driving people towards that. And so that's
so with your teams around the country now, are you doing that over Zoom, or are you getting out and about and going to see them?
A mixture. So today, as an example, I had one leadership team meeting online, one in person at one of the offices, and one at another office in person. It's a real mix, and it depends on the needs of the different businesses, and it's that sort of servient leadership thing, which is what do each of my leadership teams or each of the leaders within those teams need, and that varies from time to time, depending on where they are in their product life cycles, customer journeys, and everything else.
And can you sense sometimes that they need you there in person?
Yes.
Part of an individual's journey at a company is obviously their own development. We know that development is really important for individuals in a team. And how do you go about creating a structure? First of all, from a let's say a startup, and then through to where you are now.
At a true startup level, I think development is the byproduct of continued existence of that startup. So there's so much going on, everything is new, there aren't processes in place. Everyone is probably operating far outside their experience and their comfort zone, and having the equivalent of an MBA shoved down their throats every few weeks. As a business grows and roles become more settled and the processes get into place, then it's about providing clarity around progression structures, and to me also giving options. So it's not a linear progression, for example, in sales. There are various points at which one could branch off into other things, and that's really important. And cross-functional collaboration, particularly for younger members of the team or people who are new into that business sector, so people without that breadth of experience, are really important because they get to see how other teams work. And I would always much rather keep someone great in the business, albeit in a different function, than risk losing them because we weren't able to provide them the flexibility or the career path that they were looking for.
Yeah, I get that. This is a different subject. How do you encourage diversity and inclusion within a team, particularly, I guess, at the beginning of a business where there's less employees? That must be more difficult. But then I guess how in a larger team, for example, that you manage now, how do you ensure that there are sufficient safeguards in place to ensure that those from ethnic minorities are being given a chance?
It's a really good question. So we have a really strong people function that works very hard, including using, I can't even remember what the tool's called. There's something that checks that you're not using gendered language in job descriptions, where you advertise the jobs. There's lots that can go into that, and I think that's a pretty well explored area. I think the bit that's probably less explored and perhaps more interesting is what happens right at the start, because if you're right at the start, let's say an unfunded or pre-funded startup business, you may well end up taking anybody who comes through the door who's happy to come on the journey and agrees with the purpose and vision. I think
is it important for founders to be thinking about diversity at that stage?
I think it's really important for a founding team. So again, I'm going to use horrible phrases, but if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So I think a founding team, and all the stats I've seen show that founding teams outperform solo founders. Having a diversity of thought or world viewpoint in a founding team is really important, because you're making some pretty monumental decisions, especially at the start, which can take you wildly off course or even to the promised land if you were to go in a slightly different direction. And so that rigorous debate on lots of things is very valuable. And what I would describe as robustly expressed views that aren't held robustly is also important. So the ability to argue every side of the argument robustly but not to take it personally and to be able to let go of those viewpoints once a consensus or view is on next steps is reached is really important, because you need to properly prod this. You don't have the benefit of a research and development department or a group of people doing desktop research and insights and data analytics. So it is your debate that helps you get to the truth.
I've got 3 questions left, and I'll take you back to when you started Fixflo, and in fact, along the journey. Money aside, ignore that. Why? Why did you set up Fixflo, grow it? Why are you so excited about growing the businesses you're growing now? Why are you doing it?
That is a brilliant question. I think the answer is probably a bit multifaceted, but if I start with the big one, which is I love real estate, I love property. I worked as a real estate lawyer, I've been a property investor, and I think that parts of the property sector are fundamentally broken, and they're fundamentally broken because the processes that are followed do not engender trust. And if you have a baseline of trust and transparency, the world will be a better place. After people have eaten and had water, where they rest their head is their most important thing. And if we can help, if I can, over my career in this sector, help to make the property sector better, particularly the rental sector in all its various guises, that's what I want to do.
You mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that it's difficult to found a business and grow it. It's demanding. And there's a certain degree of stress and energy that's required for doing all of that. And I suppose you're talking about continuing to have an impact in the real estate sector. When will it be enough? When will you be able to stand back and say, I'm happy with what I've done, and I can go and retire and sit on a beach in Portugal like you've been talking about?
I think it's a lifetime's work. So I recently joined the advisory board of the property redress scheme because I'd love to add value there. So I'm looking particularly at technology with them. I work with other industry groups. It's not necessarily through the businesses I work with, but just, I guess, a desire for the property to try and help people in property.
Well, that seems like a great place to finish. You've been listening to Raj Nayyar, who is the Managing Director of Aareon Group's UK business. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John, and thanks for inviting me.
If you like this podcast and you enjoyed it, then please like and subscribe, but also email us at contact@ridgemont.co, and we'll add you to our newsletter so you can see when we release even more great content. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to speaking to you in the future.